This is Duke University.
Policymakers are often interested in trying to figure out better ways of giving people information so they can make smarter decisions for themselves. And in the past 20 years, there's been a growing recognition that the assumptions in economics that people are fully informed and fully rational aren't quite right, that we need to understand the psychology of everyday life and meld it with economics. So this melding of the two disciplines has come to be known as behavioral economics, and one of the phrases that's come out of that is nudging. Can you nudge people to make better decisions for themselves and for society? As we think about helping people make a better decision, there's a bit of a tension between, do you rely on people making smart decisions, or do you essentially remove the decisions from them and change something around them in their environment that will just guide them to the better decision without them having to do much thinking or calculating? So a great example of this tension is between the food label on the side of cereal packages, which assumes you're going to calculate things, versus a line of research that Brian Wansink at Cornell has done looking at how do you get people to eat more healthfully. His argument is, don't try to inform them, just try to change the environment in which they're in so that they eat better. So it turns out eating off of smaller plates is better than larger ones because you serve yourself less. Removing the bowl that you're serving from and keeping it in the kitchen rather than at the table helps you. In cafeterias, if you move the salad bar from the side of the room to the center, you increase the eating of salad by 30%. So his argument is, don't give people information, change the environment, and they'll make better decisions for themselves. Because policy dictates that we have to put information on the side of cars and the side of cereal packages, and because people want information, I'm more optimistic that if we were to give them less but the right information, they can recognize what's good for them, and that in combination of both trying to change the environment people operate in, as well as empowering them with better information, they can make better decisions for themselves. So the line of research that I've been working on has been, how can you give people better information to make decisions? And the important distinction is between better information and more information. There's often a temptation to give people a lot of information, and the poster child of this is the nutrition label you see on the side of a cereal package. There's, 50 pieces of information there, and most people don't know what to make of it. So can you simplify what you give people, but also help them by simplifying, focus on the right things, and then make better decisions? So in several different lines of research, we've derived a number of basic principles that we think are of general use. And they're summarized as the acronym CORE, C-O-R-E. So the principles are, do calculations for people, don't assume that they can do it themselves. Translate obscure things like energy or calories into objectives that people really care about, the cost or the weight gain that's associated with those things. Make hard to understand numbers easier to understand if you give people a relative comparison, and then give people numbers that have been expanded so they're big and they catch their attention and they translate to how people make decisions over the course of a month or a year rather than just in the moment, where we can always eat a few more calories and it doesn't make a difference, but it makes a difference over the course of a year. As we've done research on these principles, we've come up with demonstrations of their effectiveness of helping people make better decisions. So just an example of help people by doing calculations for them. One of our earliest studies was on, do people understand the energy use of different automobiles? And in the US, we're used to miles per gallon as our way of thinking about whether a car is efficient or not. And we think we know what it means, but we're tempted to do what ends up being bad math with it. So if you think about a family that has 2 cars and they're thinking about trading in one of them, both cars are driven the same distance every year, let's say 10,000 miles. If they're thinking of trading in a very inefficient vehicle, 10 mpgs for a 20 mpg vehicle, or they're thinking about trading in a 20 mpg vehicle for a 50 mpg vehicle, essentially a Prius, which one's going to save more gas? Well, intuitively, it's attractive to think about going from 20 to 50. It's a bigger difference, it's a bigger percentage improvement, but it turns out that 10 to 20 actually saves more gas than 20 to 50, and it's because you can't do that math with MPG. What you really need to be calculating is the amount of gas you're using. That's the question that's critical here. And to do that, you have to divide a distance like 10,000 miles by the MPG. And as soon as you do that, you see you have a nonlinear relationship. It's very curvilinear, where all the gains are in the teens, and then it gets very flat as you move up into the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so a simple recommendation is don't expect people to do this calculation. They don't know to do it for them. And in fact, the new EPA label that was revised in 2013 that you see on the side of every new car in a parking lot at the dealership now has a consumption metric on it, a gallons per 100 miles. Same thing with various calculations you might make as you think about paying off a credit card debt. Credit card companies will put a minimum on the statement. They want you to pay the minimum because that essentially means that you keep accumulating debt, and people don't have good intuitions that staying very close to the minimum keeps you very close to barely covering the interest that you owe, and it traps you into many, many more months of debt than if you can just manage to increase it a little bit. So it's another one of these nonlinear relationships where people have good intuitions when they're paying larger amounts of money, but they have very poor intuitions about that amount right above covering the minimum that the credit card company is asking you to pay. One of the policy revisions that's been made in this case has been warn people that if they pay the minimum, they could be trapped into debt for 10 or 12 years, and that give them a number that if they pay this month can get them out of debt in just 3 years' time, because it overcomes bad math that they would do on their own. A second basic principle that we've proposed is translate obscure things like energy and calories into objectives that people care about. So one source of confusion with light bulbs for anyone who's bought light bulbs recently is that watts has taken on a few different meanings. One is how much energy it uses, but also how bright the bulb is. And so as you think about fluorescence and LEDs, it's very confusing to compare them. What people really care about is what's the cost of using the light bulb over the life of the bulb and over the course of a year or many years. And so packaging has moved away from relying on what is a kind of hard to use number, which is watts, toward being required to give a yearly cost for the use of the light bulbs. Same thing with calories. So, I think many people have poor intuitions about how calories turns into bad health over time. So one interesting example of taking a hard-to-use number and making it more meaningful is there's been a movement toward turn calories into the number of minutes of exercise you have to do to burn off those calories. So it becomes very tangible and people know what that would look like in their everyday life, and maybe they will turn down a few extra chips or that dessert if they realize the exercise they'll have to do to burn off those calories. Our third principle is helping people to understand hard-to-use numbers by making them relative to something else. The great example of this in the energy space is a technique that the company O-Power has used, which is tell people not just how many kilowatt hours they used last month, but tell them how many their neighbors used. And so these are people in the same size house, same weather, otherwise kind of a fair comparison. When you find out that you've been using a lot more energy than a neighbor, it becomes very motivating to figure out what am I doing wrong, what can I do to improve, can I change habits or buy a more efficient refrigerator, and it becomes very motivating. And so a number that's otherwise hard to interpret, 53 kilowatt hours, is that a lot or a little, becomes more meaningful when you realize that's much worse than a neighbor or much better than a neighbor. We can think about the same kind of information for calories, once again with the kind of classic nutrition label on the side of a box having too much information and not being that useful. There's a movement towards simplifying it by putting less information on the front of the box. But even that's a little bit vague because it's fat and sugar and then other things that we may not have very good intuitions about. Is potassium good or bad? How does it compare to sodium? What should we be focusing on? And so the latest thinking has been, don't just give people numbers, but color code it so that it's meaningful to people. And essentially the proposal is use traffic lights. So use green for good, yellow for caution, and red for bad. And not only present the numbers on the front of the box, but give a comparison to other foods in terms of how good or bad they are on those dimensions. Is that a lot of calories? Is that a lot of fat compared to other foods? And then finally, our last principle is don't give people numbers on such a small scale that they don't get their attention. So a good example of this, homes are increasingly moving toward getting feedback on their kind of hourly energy use, how much electricity they're using per hour. And if you give people a cost per hour, it turns out that it's only a couple of pennies per hour. So no one's going to be that worried about using a couple of pennies per hour, but that's what adds up into dollars in weeks and then hundreds of dollars over the course of a year. So we've proposed the principle, expand things over time. And as you're thinking about buying more and less efficient appliances at Lowe's or at Home Depot, it's useful to know not just an annual cost, but even a 5-year or 10-year cost. Whatever is reasonable for the life of that appliance, you can then see that even though this one's more expensive now, I can see the cost savings in the future. And research indicates that if you give people these lifetime costs, it really does pull them then toward considering the more efficient appliance. And this overcomes a very basic human tendency, which is we don't like spending more out of our pocket right now, and anything that's kind of saved in the future is too far away to get my interest. So if you do that calculation for people and show them the expanded costs over time, you can flip people toward the more expensive one now that saves a lot of costs in the future. And so that's a summary of the stream of research that we've been working on as we've tried to figure out how do you present information in a more useful way to people? Can you simplify it to a few basic principles? And our focus has mainly been thinking about policy and consumers, but I think there are basic principles here that could be applied even by employers with their employees. If you want them to make better energy decisions or better financial decisions, there are ways of simplifying those decisions for employees as well.